Encryption keeps millions of people across the world safe, and it's doing that every day.
Millions of Ukrainians have downloaded end-to-end encrypted apps to message loved ones and share their stories with the world.
Safety is the most important thing for Ukrainians.
Encryption is playing a key role in keeping women safe when their reproductive rights are being eroded.
Encryption is safety.
Thanks so much for that video, and welcome everybody. We are so excited to have you here today. I'm just gonna pull up one document. Having an issue with my Google Drive. So sorry about that. Okay, wonderful. Welcome, folks, to our panel today on encryption beyond messaging. I'm Dr. Noam Cantor. I'm a senior public policy and government relations analyst at Mozilla. I'm excited today to learn from our panelists, and I hope you are too. I've been asked to give a message on logistics before I begin, and for that, we'll need to share a slide. So if the folks who are doing logistics could share the slide, that would be great. Awesome, thank you. We are hosting this summit on Zoom events. This is a webinar. Everyone who's attending today will not be on camera and will not be able to speak as part of the sessions. The chat function is available though on the right-hand side of your screen. So please make sure to add comments and questions on chat. The summit will be presented in English, but simultaneous interpretation is available in French and Spanish. Please choose the language you prefer by clicking on the globe icon below your screen. Closed captions are also available in English, Spanish, and French. Please select your preferred language in the closed caption icon. Now is a good time for me to thank all of the folks who worked so hard to make this event happen, including Raquel Croix. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. Now, let me introduce our panelists to you and then set the table for our discussion. First, we have Ava Black. Ava is a queer and non-binary hacker. After nearly 25 years of contributing to and leading open source projects while working in the private sector, Ava now leads open source security for the US Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency. Welcome, Ava. Next, we have Gurshabad Grover. Gurshabad is a technologist and legal researcher based in Bangalore, India. His research focuses on network security, censorship, and surveillance. He currently works as development coordinator in the Progressive International Secretariat and studies the design of censorship-resistant systems as an Iran Cyber Dialogue Fellow. Welcome. Our next panelist, Alexis Hancock, will potentially be joining us in a little bit if she's not here. She'll be joining a little later. Alexis is based at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where she works to keep the network strong and encrypted by managing the CertBot project. She believes in an open and equitable web through encouraging local tech literacy, educating other engineers, and advocating for better and stronger tech policy. Alexis has worked in web development and application security for nearly 10 years. Finally, we have Bruce Schneier. Bruce is a public interest technologist working at the intersection of security, technology, and people. Bruce is a fellow and lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School, a board member of EFF, and the chief of security architecture at Inrupt Inc. And I don't think he needs much more of an introduction to the folks here. Now, for a little table setting. There's been so much in the news this year related to encrypted messaging. As we've heard today, people around the world are rightfully concerned that their most basic right to private communication is threatened. The reason we've chosen to host this panel today is that with the focus on personal messaging, it can be easy for policymakers and the public to forget about all the ways in which encryption reaches beyond messaging. And I think it's not hyperbole to say that encryption is the foundation of the modern internet. How so? Well, here are just a few of the use cases of encryption that are so basic that we no longer blink an eye at them. Protecting computer networks from unauthorized access, ranging from the smallest academic department to the largest critical infrastructure provider. Securing financial payments, anonymizing data analysis, keeping sensitive medical records in the cloud free from prying eyes. And the list goes on and on. Reading through this list of critical applications of encryption, I can't help but note that this year is a special year for encryption. Public key cryptography was first implemented exactly 50 years ago. 3 years later, its public discovery was announced by Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman. However, just because we've had revolutionary encryption technologies for half a century does not mean that the applications have been exhausted. Let me give just one example that I like. Earlier this month, Mozilla implemented into Firefox a new feature called Encrypted Client Hello, or ECH for short. Most online communication uses a security protocol called Transport Layer Security, or TLS, to encrypt your information and keep it safe. However, there's a catch. This protection starts after an initial hello message, also known as a handshake. Unfortunately, this handshake happens in the open, exposing sensitive information like the name of the website that you're connected to. ECH addresses this vulnerability in the TLS protocol. When you use ECH, your initial hello message to a website becomes securely encrypted. Just as the applications of encryption outside of messaging have not slowed down, unfortunately, neither have misguided policies that impact that encryption. For example, Mozilla and our friends at the Internet Society have raised concerns with portions of Europe's eIDAS regulation that would threaten the security of the website authentication ecosystem. I know we'll be discussing eIDAS more when Alexis joins. I hope I've convinced you that there's a lot to celebrate and a lot to discuss here. We will have around 10 minutes for questions from the audience at the end of the panel, so please send questions through the Q&A feature throughout the discussion, and we'll get to some of them at the end. With that, let's jump into some discussion, which I'm so excited about. This question is for Bruce and Ava. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit more broadly about encryption outside of messaging. When you think of encryption outside of messaging, what applications come to mind first? What roles, in other words, does encryption play in our society outside of just ensuring the secrecy of messages? So Bruce, I don't know if you wanted to jump in first, and then Ava. I believe you're muted.
Totally rookie mistake in 2023. I mean, the answer is basically everything, right? You start out with Google Drive, right? That message, sorry, that file is encrypted on Google servers. If you have a Gmail account or an Apple Mail account, that email is encrypted on the servers. You've got a phone, the data is encrypted on the object. When I make a phone call, a voice call to you, that voice is encrypted from my handset to the tower. I mean, if you have a computer, it is likely encrypted. It's so embedded in everything you do that it's almost a weird question to ask. It's like what's the most exciting application of oxygen? It's everywhere, keeps everyone alive. And to think about encryption as only messaging, I mean, really misses sort of everything encryption does to secure things that we do every day. And it's so foundational that we never even think about it, but it's there. Anything you're doing in the cloud, anything you're doing in an object, there's likely encryption embedded in it somewhere.
Anything I would have to add to that would just be examples that back up what Bruce said. It is everywhere. If you're buying something online, your interaction with that website is encrypted. We learned 30 years ago the reasons for doing that.
Or if you don't buy something online, right, you're likely using HTTPS.
True.
And it's not just data in transit, it's data as it's stored places. Most of our data is not stored in our computers anymore, right? It's in the cloud somewhere. Dropbox, it's encrypted. It's all encrypted.
And who's looking to access that data? Just so we ground a little bit. Gershavat, I know you'll get into this a little more later, but Bruce and Ava.
I mean, the point of using encryption is to protect you from anyone that you don't want to access that data. doesn't have to be a particular entity. It's your data.
Thank you. And Alexis, welcome. I was on a different screen before, so I may not have seen exactly when you joined. So thanks for giving us a little bit of the lay of the land in terms of the applications, Bruce and Ava. So what keeps you up at night when it comes to encryption-related laws and policy around the world, outside of those policies, that are directly related to messages? And do you feel hopeful or worried? So Bruce, I was wondering if you could maybe take that first, and then we can kick it over to Gershabad and Alexis.
Yeah, I'm both hopeful and worried. I mean, the real problem with any of the laws is they tend to be narrowly intended. We want to stop terrorists with ticking time bombs or kidnappers, or, since the 90s, there have been these kind of just so stories of these applications that bad things encryption's using, and laws tend to be targeted at those uses, but they turn out not to be targeted, that the way they're written is very general, right? So it's like we say, terrorists eat at restaurants, that's bad, so we're going to ban restaurants. So the real worry is that when we look at legislation, it has much greater effects. I mean, we really don't want to allow criminals to get access to all financial transactions, but that could be a side effect of a badly written law. We don't want all of the marketers to get access to our email so they can find out what we're concerned about and sell us stuff better, right? I mean, we want better privacy than that. But with the wrongly written law, you throw out that broad application looking for the narrow use case. So what I'm really worried about are these headline grabbing, sensational, single instances that cause people to get scared, and that they will harm a very valuable technology, even to them. It ends up being a misguided effort to prevent the thing from happening again. That really seems to be, since the mid-90s, the way the story goes.
And you've really been working on it since then, so I trust you.
Our first crypto wars was 1993, Louis Free, the Clipper chip. Yes, indeed. We fight these again and again and again in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in Canada sometimes, sort of all over the English-speaking democratic world.
Gershabad, do you want to jump in as far as encryption-related law and policies around the world outside of those related to messaging?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And as Bruce and Ava said, encryption is everywhere. What I'd say needs to be done is translating what that encryption means in terms of security guarantees for you and me as citizens of the internet and the world. And when we look at what transport layer security does, or what HTTPS does, it's encrypting your connection between you and the server you're connecting to, right? And then the question you asked of who are you hiding things from, right? Becomes important, because then the server and I can see this communication. But with the popularity of HTTPS, and partly thanks to effort from folks at IFF who, advanced certbot and HTTPS everywhere, what effectively that means is at least our internet service providers don't see a lot of it. And as a corollary, any government that's mass harvesting data from internet service providers also doesn't get access to that information. When we look at messaging, end-to-end encryption between users guarantees that not even the service provider, the server can't see it, right? So even that avenue for, let's say, governmental access or third-party access, that is anyone unauthorized to see it in our sort of expectations cannot see it, right? And what is worrying me right now, and this is partly colored by the recent events in India, is the question of when we'll get to encryption at rest by default on our devices, right? Some of the advances we've seen that we've already discussed, right? Like HTTPS, browsers came together, and again, thanks to EFF now, servers could easily support HTTPS. So we got there. Or like when WhatsApp decided to move to end-to-end encryption a few years ago, instantly, or like basically overnight, it meant millions in India were using end-to-end encryption instead of normal, like where you have an intermediary server in the middle, right? So all of these initiatives have been guided by these infrastructural choices by service providers and civil society. But what we haven't achieved yet is encryption at default in our devices, right? And just to highlight the importance of that mechanism, if you have an access to a device, you basically get access to the WhatsApp, right? Or what you communicated with the server. So some of those guarantees that we took for granted in the context of HTTPS and end-to-end encryption for messaging are instantly undermined. And how this happened, what happened in India recently is that the government was detaining journalists and they were seizing their devices. Now, because of the lack of a legal framework that tells them that these are your safeguards, they like basically that framework doesn't exist, right? In India, there was only recently a Supreme Court, I mean, this was 6 years ago. I don't know why I said recent, but only 6 years ago, the Supreme Court affirmed the right to privacy, but it's not as worded as like a right against unlawful seizure or unjust seizure, like that, let's say, holds true in the US. And what that means is when the police has your device, they could force you to present your fingerprint and unlock it, right? And same for laptops. There are not many procedural safeguards. And basically, when they have access to that device, you see everything that you assumed you were hiding from third-party access, right? And so just about where the responsibility lies, of course, it lies on us to push for such a mechanism to be default. But of course, if the supply side sort of market theory is true, then some of that responsibility we should also be pushing towards the basically oligopoly that we have in the market of operating systems. So that includes like Apple, Google, Microsoft, etc.
Thanks for giving us the an understanding of where the rubber hits the road on the legal side as well. I appreciate that. Alexis, how about you? What keeps you up at night when it comes to laws and policies outside of those related to messaging?
Absolutely. So thank you for having me. One of the things that keeps me up is the framing of encryption and in certain laws that if you're using encryption, then you must be doing something nefarious, and that's simply not true. Being pushed to the forefront as a barrier to democracy, even, or a barrier to a just society, that's what keeps me up normally, because encryption has been such a great tool for the people on the fringes, the people who are marginalized, people who need encryption every day around the world, and not just in the more democratic countries, but the more democratic countries are pushing legislation that could potentially weaken it. And it is of my belief that if encryption is not strong in the most democratic countries in the world, then it'll just become weaker across the world, across the board. So that's my major worry that keeps me up at night, is that encryption gets framed as some sort of like, blanket for war on nouns. Bruce mentioned the early 90s and kind of like the framework that's been happening since then. And I usually frame it as the war on nouns, the war on drugs, war on terror. And it's very much so war on people, and it gets pushed to the forefront where technology can be harmed, or innovation in technology can be harmed to protect the people during these times of fear. And so when we have wars on nouns, we have to be very careful how we're framing security, how we're protecting people, because it's not just about the nouns, it's about the impact and the harms that can happen from legislation, from when people are scared. And that's usually what really keeps me up at night, is what happens to people, and what happens to people in power when they know the people are scared. And are they going to act in the most democratic way possible? Are they acting in the best interest of the people? Or is it going to be turned into some sort of form of abuse? not every government is acting in the best interest of the people. Not every sector of the government is always acting in the best interest of the people. And a lot of this legislation that I've seen recently around, end-to-end encryption or web security, it's the framework that, oh, this government will never do that sort of abuse, even though there's a track record, a known track record from many different governments to act in some sort of form of abuse, no matter how democratic they are or presented around the world. So that's my main worry that usually keeps me up, and I try my best to combat that in that sense.
Thanks. I think that just reminds me also of the importance of speaking to people who use these technologies for critical uses, whether it's journalists or just everyday people, rather than just policymakers or just technologists. I think you're absolutely right. I'd like to turn to Ava, switch topics a little bit. Ava, I know that your primary focus in your current role is the security of the open source ecosystem. That's really exciting to me because at Mozilla, we're huge fans of the open source ecosystem. And it's a key component of the modern programming environment. In a recent report you wrote, I saw a statistic that more than 96% of code bases use open source code. Hopefully I got that stat right. Could you explain how regulation related to encryption might impact open source?
Thanks, Noam. So going back again to the crypto wars, the basis of open source, it's a legal framework, a license for sharing software. There's a community around it. There's lots of code. There's different projects. There's differences between the different types of licenses, but ultimately it's a software license. And all of the knock-on effects of being able to share and have sort of a digital sovereignty, to borrow the phrase of a colleague of mine, control over our own systems. And that includes the self-determination of what software to use, how to use it, to modify it, to share it with friends. That's sort of the basis of open source. But it grew out of the crypto wars in the 90s. And this fight over being able to share and publish encryption algorithms. And so a regulation that hypothetically in one country or anywhere else might outlaw or modify the right of people to publish an encryption algorithm. I don't want to, I can't predict how that would affect open source as a whole, but it would, because it would bring us back to the same kind of debates we had in the 90s about, well, can I share this idea in a machine readable or human readable form that you could then reproduce and have some code to do end-to-end encryption? Yeah, and we're 30 plus years past that. And
so much. Oh, yes.
I'll add to that. Sorry, there's also ongoing efforts to regulate open source around the world right now, not specific to encryption, but again, it's an evolving space. I don't know what this will look like in 5 years.
Thanks. I guess we're seeing a theme of unintended consequences here. When you regulate or pass laws in a particular area where you might have good intentions, there might be many knock-on effects that you aren't necessarily expecting. I think given that statistic of 96% of code bases using open source code, seems pretty worrying to mess with that. Now, Ava, one of the coolest applications of encryption that I've learned about recently is trust verification and software distribution. What's the hype there, and why would you need security in software distribution?
Yeah, so encryption, as you mentioned at the beginning of this, is based on Diffie and Hellman's work 50 years ago in public key cryptography. The other side of public key cryptography is identity verification or verification of integrity of something. Under the hood, it's very much the same math, just written in a different algorithm. And so if I write some software for whatever it might be, for your phone, for your media console, a web browser, whatever it is, and you want to know that you've downloaded the same software that I wrote, it wasn't modified in transit or while sitting on your computer and you weren't looking, someone else changed it. That's integrity verification. You might also want to know that I wrote it and not, I don't know, Alexis or somebody else, that you didn't expect to write it, and that's identity verification. This is all based on the same math. And so there's been a big movement because open source software has become so deeply integrated in software supply chains and also hardware supply chains. IoT devices, your smart fridge, your phone, the latest Mars rover, airplanes, cars, medical devices, they all contain open source software. It is literally all around us all the time, embedded in the digital devices in our world. And up until relatively recently, folks weren't paying very much attention to the integrity, the verification of the open source distribution channels. Right? Linux distros, Linux has had a pretty robust system, but a lot of the other ones, there's packages with just a single maintainer. And we've seen in the past 5-10 years, the high profile issues like Heartbleed about a decade ago, Log4Shell 2 years ago, those make headlines. What doesn't make headlines is hundreds of other smaller cases where a single developer gets, they forget or they win the lottery and walk away from maintaining their project. The DNS expires, someone else takes it over and uses it for nefarious ends. And that's where a change in the identity of the developer, if you had identity verification built into the software supply chain, might have been able to alert companies and people that, hey, this is no longer a piece of software I should be running. Something's gone wrong. But we don't have that widely today. And so there's been a pretty large effort, and it's part of why I joined where I'm working right now, to try and advance supply chain security for open source, because it underpins so much of our digital world today. And encryption and public key cryptography is an essential part of that. We couldn't secure a supply chain without it.
Alexis, I know you've also thought a lot about the software trust verification chain. So I was wondering if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, sure. I'm often thinking about the tools given to open source developers over time. Like Ava, they had mentioned, right, like the Heartbleed bug and everything, and it kind of revealed the lack of support in the open source community as well. Even though that these tools are widely distributed, there's often a meme or a joke that usually gets passed around, how like there's this major project and it's like some tireless person in Nebraska somewhere that's actually maintaining it. So that's honestly a metaphor that still rings true today, where a lot of the projects you use, it might just be 2 or 3 people, if that, maintaining these projects. And it's very real people that need support behind these. Some of them might not even have the money or the infrastructure to actually uphold and use to put into their pipeline and distribute to everyone. A lot of these open source ideas was like, look, there's a hole usually, and it's usually created by proprietary software, where a lot of the proprietary software will not have some sort of feature or some sort of, support for something, and then somebody takes it upon themselves and does it and makes it open source, and and that's tireless work. It's thankless work half the time. But thankfully I've seen more tools that are more readily available for developers. There's still some pain points. To be trusted on Windows is still kind of an expensive process. To be immediately trusted versus reputational trust versus immediate trust is a cost. It's not about how the integrity of the developer, it's how much money you have. So unfortunately, there's still some barriers there to gain trust in certain areas. And so Linux is a little bit easier as someone who distributes software cross-platform. You can utilize PGP for different packaging and distro systems, right? And you can have your public key cryptography that will verify certain things now. I'm seeing efforts like SigStore out of the Linux Foundation that actually is tackling things like, vulnerable NPM packages. There's other sorts of ways of confirming these open source tools, like signing official containers on Docker and making sure images, because, scanning vulnerabilities wasn't enough. Just showing that something was wrong with something in your open source software with a dependency wasn't enough. It was being able to actually integrate changes if needed and actually apply those changes and not have to go and manually discover these things yourself as an open source developer. So I'm seeing tools get a little better to help open source developers actually think about security in the forefront as they're developing. Even with things like GitHub, like you can have your Git commit signed now with your PGP key or your public key, right? And that's something I've actually liked a lot, because now you can see a verification of identity in some sense where, okay, the person who made this commit is the person who they say they are, at least through this chain, right? So it's like a chain of trust that gets established now when you're committing to these projects and saying who you are and verifying that is the code where it came from. And being able to sign said code was as an entire ecosystem that's still in development, but I'm glad that we're in a better place now than we used to be, because if you would have told me, hey, you need all your code signed and ready on each platform, I probably would have cried just to figure out how to do that, because it's like, well, with what tools, what's out there, and the tools, 10 years ago weren't really robust and weren't really helpful and not really well documented. And there are a lot of tools still not well documented. I'm still giving talks and still giving talks on how to do these things, because I usually find out something pretty major in the process that's not well documented. And then I take it upon myself to tell other open source developers, this is the pain that I went through. Hopefully that you won't have to go through this pain now that you know this from me. And these are the things I wish I knew. So documentation needs to get better. Tools need to get a little bit more robust, but I am seeing efforts, and I'm really glad that that's happening, because a lot of this was open source developers aren't thinking about security, as we didn't have the tools for a long time for practical cryptography, for practical security. I'm all about cryptography for the people. I see Ava, but it's like there's there is debate around that, but I do think there's a general understanding and it needs to happen to use these tools in general. And I didn't think that general knowledge was really present in there for a long time. But now that I'm seeing more of an effort that's around funding for open source development and funding for open source developers and software, I have a lot more hope than I used to around seeing this become mainstream, where dependencies and large libraries are getting support.
Thanks so much. That I guess that also just made me understand a little bit more how a lot of these encryption, these efforts to promote encryption in ways that keep us really safe are still in progress as far as like getting them fully implemented in our society. I think that that's really important to me as I think about the policies that might throw off those processes or stymie them. That like some of them are still in progress, right? And so it's difficult to put into place policies that might affect that negatively. Gershabot, I want to turn to you. We've been talking about messaging related encryption a little bit as separate from general encryption. I'm wondering, if they are separate, or whether, when laws impact messaging technologies, do they also impact encryption outside of messaging? Kind of where is the line there from a technical and policy perspective?
Thank you. I think this is a great question, because at least in the recent past, it is true that governments are focusing their regulations and laws on messaging applications that are using end-to-end encryption. But from the old key escrow proposals, now we have things like client-side scanning and traceability, which were discussed at more length in the previous panels at this summit. I think outside messaging, I think there's one class of sort of laws and regulations that I've seen that are aimed at encryption just broadly and generally. And one example of that would be the one I'm most familiar is with the draft encryption policy that India released in 2015. And in a strange way, that harked back to the first crypto wars because it had guidelines that you could, so with an encryption scheme or mechanism, you could only use a key size of this size, right? And what that meant is, the government has at least some sort of capability, if not now or in the near future, that they could decrypt those, not just communications, right? Then that policy was actually taken back by the government after public criticism. So that's a win there. But a similar thing survives in what are called the unified license agreements in India. And all telecom service providers and internet service providers have to sign this agreement with the license with the government. And it also has a strange thing that says bulk encryption is prohibited. That sounds bad, but thankfully the good thing is that the government just wrote that and forgot about it, and no one knows what that actually means. So that's something that's in the law books, but practically didn't have an impact. Lastly, I think there are regulations that are not aimed at encryption at all, but may have a side effect at the very least. And I think a recent example of this is the Digital Markets Act that in an effort to increase competition in the messaging space or in to decrease the sort of market consolidation, it asked service providers to explore mechanisms of interoperability in messaging applications. And I'd say technically that wouldn't undermine the security guarantees that we would have of such encryption, but how they translate to practically what we expect from our messaging applications, right? Like if there's an API at the end of your device that allows you to share messages to different parties, and that happens without your notice, for instance. So yeah, like those are conversations about, like, I think device control, but yeah, I think to me they fall in the class of problems that you had a good intention, you didn't want to actually impact in encryption, but you sort of disturb the the balance that we have, at least, and we need to reevaluate how to sort of reconcile our control over devices. We do want full control, and we want our devices to do whatever we want, but we shouldn't, for the general public, it shouldn't mean that their expectations of security from messaging or other encryption is undermined.
Thanks. I like that example of unintended consequences from legislation that's totally unrelated to encryption at all. Bruce, you unmuted. Do you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I just unmuted because I didn't want to make the same mistake I made in the beginning of this seminar.
Great. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. I see a few questions in the chat, but I'm gonna maybe leave 5 minutes for those and ask a few more questions to our panelists first. Bruce, I'm wondering if you could help me explain a little bit, help me understand a little bit the chain of trust of encryption on the internet. There are a lot of acronyms in networking security, TLS, which I talked about before, CAs, HTTPS. What's the kind of basis of networking security? For example, starting with a certificate authority.
So there's a lot of them, and for the audience, I mean, I don't think you want to do acronyms or any math. And basically, we try to start from something trusted and move forward. So the trust might start from the fact that you have a contractual relationship with your cell phone provider that knows your name and is able to bill you. Or it might start from the fact that a big company like Google says it's so. And then we move forward from there. It might be really sloppy. It might be, I trust this website because there's a bunch of stuff in my computer that says I should trust it. And that is sometimes subverted. So the chains of trust are complicated. You think about Bluetooth. The chain of trust starts from you stand next to the object, push a button, and it's because of that proximity and moment in time that establishes trust that moves outwards. It's actually very hard to set up chains of trust, and all the ones we have do have flaws. If you think about security attacks, you can think about ways to attack everything I've just mentioned. But we're trying our best here in an environment where things don't start face to face, right? In normal life, I trust you because I met you. Like, I actually don't trust you because I've never seen you before. I don't know your name. I mean, I see a name on the screen. Is it right? Who knows? But were this a more complicated social environment, I'd be introduced to you by somebody, and there'd be some slow set of things that have rituals that cause us to trust each other. So change of trust in the internet are hard. We're basically doing our best, and it's based on a lot of different things, and yes, a lot of different acronyms.
Ava, do you want to jump into that? Is that why you unmuted?
Yeah, I'd love to add a little comment on that. I like to think of trust as having three basic properties. It's contextual, it's time-bounded, and it's asymmetrical, right? I choose to trust this person in this way, maybe not to fly an airplane, but to drive a car, whatever. When we talk about trusting things, that doesn't really make sense in a human way. We're proxying the thing for the human system behind it. So I choose to trust my bank's website because I've chosen to trust my bank. I choose to trust this phone because, as Bruce said, of the company that built it and their processes that I'm choosing to place my trust in. And I guess all of the ways in which digital trust chains, all the technology that supports them, come from that principle of someone built this, whether it was the code or the system or the specification or the algorithm, and we're choosing to place trust in that set of people.
Thank you. I think I've heard the phrase encryption moves trust, maybe, which sounds a little bit like what both of you are saying. Still need to trust someone somewhere. Great. So we have about 7 minutes left. I was wondering, Alexis, if you could give us a very brief understanding. I mentioned earlier the EIDAS regulation, and we talked a little bit about trust. Could you explain to us a little bit about the EIDAS regulation in the EU and concerns that folks have had with it? I know you've worked on that.
Yeah, so I'll try to quickly walk through it. So EIDAS, or the European Electronic Identification and Authentication Trust Services, is the acronym, right? Alphabet soup, it's everywhere. So it's a regulation in the EU that mainly is a framework for a digital wallet for EU citizens. That is the summation of that. But there's a piece to that that had a lot to do with web security, which is the piece I focused on, which was Article 45. Article 45 pushed a type of cert, and that would only be used and issued by EU certificate authorities or trusted service providers, I believe is the acronym for that. But you can think of it as a certificate authority blessed by the national side of things in EU states. So they would issue these types of certificates. I won't get into the acronym of what type of certificate it is, but it's an identity-based TLS certificate. So they also pushed in Article 45 how it should be seen or viewed by the user in the browser. So there's a couple problems that we had in the security community about it, and especially in Web PKI land, where the problems around this article and the proposed rules and changes that it initially had was that the way it addresses web security itself in a current state, it forces a process for TLS. What the TLS wasn't meant to solve. It wasn't meant to solve the issue of identity itself. That is not what TLS was meant to solve. And we tried this, and we kind of tried this with extended validated certificates, or validation certificates, and pushing the identity process of a background check into the TLS certificate or the web certificate that we have. We've tried this, and there's debates and arguments of whether or not an extended validation certificate is normal versus what we currently have normally on the web is called a domain validated certificate, which is, thanks to the efforts like Let's Encrypt, it helps keeps most of the web encrypted. It treats TLS as inherently broken. I don't like that at all. This article treats it as there's a problem that needs to be solved with TLS, and this is not where that context should be framed. It frames free security as bad security. The certificates that they want to push aren't cheap, and they aren't free. It discourages automation in web security because domain validated certificates you can automate because you can automate domain control, but you cannot automate identity. proof and validation. So once again, it pushes TLS to do something that it wasn't meant to do. And so and also ultimately, with the bigger worry was slows and inhibits browser reaction to security events. What if there's a bad actor as a certificate authority, right? And they're improperly issuing web certificates, or improperly issuing something, or even having a bad practice of some kind. This regulation would have stepped in the way of that process and slowed it down, because right now browsers can act almost immediately through an assessment process and take down the CA. But unfortunately, with this regulation put in play and the proposed rules, it would slow down that process to a law. And laws are slow. Laws are 2 to 3 years. We don't have 2 to 3 years to wait for web security. And so the last piece of that is geopolitical. It sets a precedent. The internet is not just Europe. The internet is, everyone uses the internet around the world. You can't put geopolitical borders on the internet. People can try, but I don't like that approach in this case, even though it's trying to address, cybercrime and such with EU citizens and establish identity and trust through web services. I understand that pain, but the internet is not just Europe. So you can't make legislation based off your country and your country's problems if it impacts web security as a whole for everyone. Taking power from US companies and rebalancing it, and competition, innovation. I don't have a problem with those pieces, but you shouldn't harm web security in the pursuit of such. And it sets a bad precedent for other countries to follow as well. So other countries may use this framework. So they're in the trilogues right now. It's been a very long process. I think about 2 years now we've been going through this article, revising it. And our main thing is trying to just make sure that browsers can act if something goes wrong with one of these certificate authorities. That's our main goal. We would like for this to be rolled back completely and start, and just keep the same text and rhetoric that they had before, because it doesn't prevent usage of quotes with the original text. You can, or the certificates that they're pushing. It doesn't prevent the use of these identity certificates in the web browser. They're currently in use, but it's just, this certificate forces other factions at play that harms web security and treats TLS like it's inherently broken, and treats free security as bad security. And those are the pieces right now that we are trying to land with the final bits of text in Article 45.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Alexis. I wanted to make sure to hit on EIDAS just because, it's an active and moving piece of legislation. Wonderful. Well, we are coming up on time here. I think that we, in the various questions, I think we answered a lot of the questions that were in the chat, so I won't go specifically through those. But I wanted to thank you all so much for joining us today, our speakers and folks in the, folks watching the webinar. We're going to have a 10-minute break before the next panel. The next panel is content moderation in encrypted environments. You won't want to miss it. So I hope you enjoyed this panel. I know I learned a lot about the chain of trust on the internet, about encryption at rest, about the effect of encryption regulation on the open source environment. So thank you all so much, and I hope you agree. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.